Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of these uncomputable problems. The first one is ambiguity resolution in language. So you may not realize it, but language is filled with ambiguity. I think it's kind of a miracle that we actually communicate relatively effectively. And one reason is because it's not uncommon for a sentence to have multiple meanings. So we may not entertain most of those interpretations. We may discount them or ignore them immediately, but they're nevertheless present. So, for example, somebody tells you that their dad is bugging them. You could think that the dad's sprinkling bugs on them, which would be a weird thing, but it could happen, or that he's spying on them, right? He planted a bug in their room. Now, of course, the most likely interpretation is that he's simply annoying her. So you would just use context, and the other things are unlikely. And so you would probably just assume that it's the dad who's annoying, that the dad's annoying her. And so we're going to talk about ambiguity resolution and natural language processing. So the previous sentence, my dad is bugging me, I think it's kind of trivial. Most people would realize what the correct response is based on context. However, there are other contexts or situations or sentences where it's not clear. For example, the spy saw the man with the binoculars. Right? So is the spy using the binoculars at the man to look at the man, or is the spy looking at the man who is wearing the binoculars? In other words, are the binoculars being used by the man or the spy? Are they associated with the object of the sentence, which is man, or the subject of the sentence, which is spy? And in this situation, it's not really clear which interpretation is correct. Though I would suspect that many of you would interpret the sentence as saying that the spy has binoculars, right? So most of you would go with this interpretation on the right. And there's two reasons for this. One of them is that you're using semantics, right? You're using semantics to resolve the ambiguity. Binoculars are tools of spies, and so therefore it's likely that the spy has the binoculars. So you would likely pick this right interpretation simply because it's more plausible. However, the other reason why we might interpret this sentence as the spy having the binoculars is because there's a bias to select the interpretation that is syntactically less complex. So you would likely pick this one on the right, but that's because the spy with the binoculars is a less syntactically complex sentence, which we're going to talk about. And this is what we call minimal attachment. It's a preference for interpretations with simpler syntactic structures. Okay. So this is, yeah, as I mentioned, this is called minimal attachment, and it involves attaching new information in a sentence, and you're attaching that new information onto a sentence structure using the fewest grammatical or syntactic objects, right? And so we're going to talk more about this in later lectures, but you can make what's called a syntax tree. These are syntax trees, and you can do this for any sentence. And in a syntax tree, you start with the sentence, so S above, right? And then within that sentence, you may have a noun phrase, a verb phrase, right? So NP, VP, as well as determiners like the word the. Nouns are symbolized by N, and verbs are symbolized by V. Prepositional phrases are symbolized, excuse me, by the letters PP. And then prepositions are P, right? Are represented by P. And there's other one, you can do this. There's other kinds of grammatical objects, but for these sentences, you only need those grammatical objects, right? And so if you count the number of blue things, so blue grammatical objects, you'll find, here, let's just do it. So one, S is one, noun phrase is two, verb phrase is three. So one, two, three, four, five, six, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Right? So there's 15 grammatical objects in the left interpretation of the sentence. And you can count this for yourself, but there's actually 14 grammatical objects in this sentence, right? And so we would say because the right interpretation, the rightmost interpretation has fewer grammatical objects, we would say that this sentence or interpretation of this sentence is less syntactically complex than this sentence. And this, again, this shows that we can use semantics and syntax to resolve ambiguity. And those are just a few of the things we can use. We can use all kinds of information, context, frequency, statistical patterns of the language. But I would say those are maybe the big ones, right? So based on syntax and semantics, or mainly semantics, you'd probably pick the right interpretation as the most plausible interpretation. So now we'll talk about another example of ambiguity resolution in natural language learning. So for example, imagine I showed you this picture, right? We got a candle, a feather, a cheetah with a candle, and then a frog with a feather. So imagine you saw this picture and then I said, choose the frog with the feather. Now, does this mean that you should select the frog that is holding a feather or select the feather and then use the feather to select the frog? And my guess is that many of you would have selected the frog, just gone straight to the frog. And you were probably confused when I said with the feather because there's only one frog, right? So if there were two frogs, it would make sense to pick the frog with the feather because with the feather, it describes which frog would be needed to be chosen, right? So, however, if what if the instruction was, you know, to tickle the frog with the feather? I bet most of you would pick the feather and then tickle the frog, even though I may want you to tickle the frog that's holding a feather, right? That's still a possibility. And so this uncertainty is about whether the phrase with the feathers with the feather should be used as an instrument or as a modifier phrase that describes the frog, right? That describes which frog to tickle. So as I said, if there were two frogs and I said one didn't have the feather and I said do something with the frog with the feather, you'd probably go straight to the frog with the feather because the with the feather part is describing which frog to pick. But in this case, there's only one frog, so you're not sure whether to pick you wouldn't be sure which picture to pick. Um, and so uh, and so this phrase would be less likely to be used as a modifier. But the verb choose has developed a bias due to how it tends to be used in everyday language, right? There's a distribution. If you were to look at how often choose, the word choose was used and where, and what kind of sentences it was used, you would find that the verb choose was more likely to be used in a certain way. And the way that it's likely to be used is that it encourages people to interpret the with the feather as a descriptor, as a description of which frog, right? It describes which frog to pick, to choose. So you'd be more likely to pick the frog with the feather if I said choose the frog with the feather. And that's because the word choose is more likely to be used in that way in a modifier context. In contrast, the verb uh, the verb tickle is a little bit more intuitive. The verb tickle has developed a bias that encourages people to interpret the prepositional phrase of with the feather as an instrument that should be used. So the choose verb has a modifier bias, and the verb tickle has an instrument bias just because of how those verbs are typically used. And so this lexical information is shaped by statistical patterns of the language, which helps resolve linguistic ambiguity. Okay, in the next video, we'll talk about referent indeterminacy and learning new words.